Today we're sewing a fully lined vest with a notched collar and welt pockets. This is a free pattern that you can get at Sewciety. It's the Janet Cosplay Vest. The outer fabric that I'm using today is a lime green wool from Rex Fabrics. I've left the link below so you can check out their vast fabric collection. I've also left a link to the pattern so you can print it out and sew along with me. Let's get started. The pattern instructions recommend that we interface all of our main vest pieces. So I've gone ahead and interfaced both sets of my front pieces, both of my side front pieces, my back pieces, and the top edges of both of my welt and pocket pieces with a piece of interfacing that measures 2 inches by 5.5 inches. I've transferred the darts to the wrong side of my back pattern piece, just transferring those lines faintly here. Now I'm going to pin the dart in place, folding it in half vertically, and pinning through one dart leg and out the other. Doing this for both back pieces. Then take it to your sewing machine and follow those dart lines from the top to the bottom, leaving thread tails on both ends so that you can tie them in knots. Now place those back pieces right sides together and pin your center back seam. Sew your center back seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press your seam open. Then place your side front pieces right sides together with your back piece and pin your side seams. And then sew both side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press them open. Then place your front pieces right sides together with the side front pieces and pin the princess seam. Doing this on both sides. Sew both of those seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. Now that the princess seams are sewn, we're going to clip into the curves. Doing that on both sides. And press those seams open. Repeat all of the previous steps to construct your lining, starting with your back darts, all the way through to your princess seams. Now to prepare the opening at the top of the welt pocket piece, I've centered and drawn a rectangle at the top that's 4¼ inches long and 3/4 inch wide. I've centered it so that it's about 1 inch from the top of the piece and 3/4 inch from the side edge. I've drawn this rectangle onto the interfacing of both pieces and also transferred it onto the right side of the piece. Here's the bottom edge area of my center front bodice piece. There are no welt pocket indicators on the pattern piece, so you can kind of just eyeball where you want your welt to be. I've traced my welt opening to the same dimensions as I traced onto the pocket pieces earlier, and I've situated it so that it's about 2¼ inches from the outer edge and about 1 inch above where the waistcoat begins to angle toward the bottom. I've traced the welt onto the right side of the fabric, as well as to the wrong side, and I've done this on both sides of the vest. Now I'm going to place my pocket piece right sides together with the welt I drew onto the bodice. I'm going to align all of the lines of my rectangle and pin in place. Then take this to your sewing machine and sew through all layers all around the rectangle, trying to get a nice clean pivot at each corner. Now we're going to slash horizontally through the center of this welt, starting and stopping the slash 1/2 inch away from our stitching on both sides. Now from where we started and stopped our slash, we're going to clip to each of the corners of the rectangle, carefully clipping to but not through the stitching. Now that we have an opening, we can take our pocket piece and push it through to the wrong side of the garment, and then take it to your ironing board and give that opening a good press. And here's what that welt will look like on the inside. Now we're going to take the bottom of the pocket and fold it upward. And just make sure that that bottom seam allowance of the welt is nice and flat. Take your pocket once again and fold it downward, leaving a little bit of overlap of fabric at your welt area. Now we've created the lip of fabric that's going to cover that opening from the front of the garment. You just want there to be enough material here to align with the top edge of your welt. And then pin it in place along both side edges. Now I'm going to flip my garment over so I can more easily access the seam underneath this pocket. I want to pin that bottom seam allowance of the welt to the pocket here. Now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew straight across that bottom seam allowance, following my original stitching line. And now here's what that should look like from the outside. And now from the inside, we want to sew the short edges of the rectangle to the tiny triangles that are underneath. We're going to sew them together right along that stitching line that we stitched earlier, doing that on both sides. Then you can take the bottom of the pocket and fold it up once again so that all of the edges match and pin in place. For the top seam allowance of the welt, we're going to be sewing along the original stitching line just as we did to secure the bottom of the welt earlier. So pin the seam allowance to the top of the pocket here. Now we can take this to the sewing machine and starting from one bottom fold of the pocket, sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance until you get to where your horizontal seam allowance begins at the top edge. Then you're going to pivot across, sewing along that seam allowance's original stitching line, and then stopping a 1/2 inch away from the side edge of the pocket. Then you can continue sewing the remainder of the pocket with a 1/2 inch seam allowance until you're back at the bottom folded edge. Remember that we're just sewing the edges of the pockets here and we're not sewing the pocket to the front of the garment. So here's what my finished welt pocket looks like on the inside and on the outside of the garment. Repeat all of those steps to complete your welt pockets on both sides. Now place your front and back pieces right sides together along the shoulder seams. And right at these inner corners of the shoulder seam, I'm going to mark a point so that as I'm stitching that horizontal shoulder seam, I know where to stop my stitching a 1/2 inch beyond that point. I'm going to mark those points on both sides and then pin together those shoulder seams. If you like, you can further secure those stopping points for your stitching with pins. Now starting from the outer edge, backstitching to secure, sew along that shoulder seam until you get to the dot that you marked, again backstitching to secure. Doing this on both sides. And then press those shoulder seams open. Now place the center backs of your lapel pieces right sides together. Pin in place. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and press your seams open. So here's the center back seam of the lapel that we just sewed. And here are my shoulder seams. I want to open up these seam allowances a little bit here so that we can sew straight across this neckline seam. So at the inner corner of the shoulder seam, I'm going to clip from that corner right to where my shoulder stitching ended at the dot that we marked earlier. And do this on both sides. Now that we have a little bit of ease in those seams, we can pin this neckline seam. Match the center back of your bodice with the center back of your lapel and pin in place. And then continue pinning that lapel to the back bodice across both sides. Now that that's pinned, we're going to start our stitching from where our shoulder stitching ended and sew straight across, right to where our shoulder stitching ended on the opposite side as well. Back stitching at both sides to secure. And now here's what that collar looks like from the outside. Now go ahead and sew the neckline and lapel of your lining fabrics in the same exact way. Place your main and lining vest pieces right sides together and pin all around the entire outer edges. On your front pattern piece, you have a dot indicating the pivot point for our stitching around the notched collar. Transfer these markings onto your fabric on both sides. Now starting at one bottom center front, we're going to sew all around the garment with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, pivoting at the outer notched collars and remembering to sew all the way to the dot that you just marked, and then pivoting once again to continue sewing all the way around. Remember to backstitch at the start and stop of your stitching to secure. Now we're going to clip from the corner of our notched collar to the points that we drew onto our fabric, clipping to but not through the stitching. Also trim all of your corners. Now we can turn the vest right side out through the armholes. And make sure to nicely poke out all those corners. I've cut a 1.5 inch wide strip from my main fabric so that it measures the distance around my armhole plus a few inches. I'm going to fold one of the short ends of the tape to the wrong side by about 1/2 inch. And I'm going to line up the lining fabric and my outer fabric all the way around the armhole so that their raw edges align all the way around. Then starting at the underarm seam, I'm going to take the short edge of my binding and place it right sides together with the outer fabric and start pinning in place. Continue pinning the binding all around the armhole so that all of the edges meet together. Once your binding is back where you started, allow the excess tape to overlap the folded edge by about 1 inch or a little bit less, and then cut off the excess and pin in place. Now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and sew all the way around the armhole with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to trim that seam allowance by about 1/2. Now we can take this binding and flip it over its seam allowance, and then we're going to understitch. We're going to sew the binding to the seam allowance, edge stitching close to that seam all the way around. Take your outer edge of the binding and fold it to the seam line, and then fold the entire binding on the seam line and pin in place. Continue tucking that raw edge of the binding under and pinning along that seam line all the way around the armhole. Now that that's pinned all the way around, I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and edge stitch close to that inner fold of my binding all the way around. Now that the armholes are finished, we can top stitch the entire outer edge of the vest. We're going to top stitch all around the bottom edges, all around the center fronts, and all around the collar. Just to make sure I get a nice crisp line, I'm going to pin everything in place first, all the way around. Along the bottom, you can slightly roll the lining to the inside so that it's not visible from the outside of the garment. Now I'll take it to the sewing machine and top stitch all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm going to prepare to sew my buttonholes into my right front piece. And I've placed pins here where I'm going to sew my 5 buttonholes. Just using the line drawing of the pattern to determine where I'm going to place these buttonholes, I'm going to have my top button align with my underarm seam, and my bottom button will be about where the center front begins to taper to the point at the bottom. And I've spaced my buttons about 2 inches apart from each other. And now I'm ready to sew the buttonholes. Then place your right center front over the left to mark where you want your buttons to go on the left side. And then sew your buttons in place. And now your vest is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you check out the rest of my video library for more great sewing inspiration, and I'll see you in the next video.